Prologue. They left me on a Thursday. I remember the day because I had been paying attention to days, in the way you pay attention to things when you suspect they are numbered. The Thursday detail is not dramatic. It is simply the fact of it. Thursday, the 14th of December, the temperature already below freezing. The kind of cold that did not negotiate. The kind that arrived each year in the eastern woodlands, like a creditor who had been patient long enough and was now collecting. 6 of them walked me to the boundary. My uncle did not come. That is the thing I want you to understand first, before anything else. Before the cold, before the forest, before the 6 years that followed. My uncle, Isolde Vorn, alpha of the Ashvale pack, the man who had raised me after my parents died when I was 7. The man I had called family for 16 years and trusted with the specific trust of someone who has no one else and has therefore put everything they have into the one basket available. He did not come to the boundary. He sent 6 wolves who would not meet my eyes and a formal exile declaration in pack language that stripped me of my rank, my mark, my weapons, and my status as an Ashvale member. He did not come because he could not look at what he was doing. I want to be precise about this because precision has always mattered to me, and because the imprecise version, the version that makes him a monster, that makes it simpler than it was, does not serve the truth, and the truth is the only thing I have ever been interested in. He was not a monster. He was a man who had made a decision that protected himself and his position and required the removal of the one person who had the evidence and the willingness to use it. He made the calculation that I was the variable that needed to be eliminated, and he was right, in the narrow sense of people who are right about tactics and entirely wrong about everything that matters. He made the calculation. He sent 6 wolves. He did not come himself. I stood at the boundary, and I watched the 6 wolves walk back toward the pack lights, and I held my wolf, who was howling in my chest with the specific wolf-deep devastation of an animal being severed from its pack, from its territory, from everything that biology had told it was necessary for survival. I held her still and quiet, and I did not make a sound. Not one sound. I stood at the boundary of the territory where I was born, with the winter air cutting through the training gear they had left me, and I waited until the lights were gone, and the sound of their footsteps had been swallowed by the forest, and the night was completely, finally mine. Then I turned around. I faced the eastern forest. I am going to tell you what I felt in that moment, and I am going to tell you the truth of it, rather than the version that flatters me. I was 23 years old, and I was alone in a forest in winter, with no weapons and no shelter, and the temperature dropping, and the particular devastating silence of a woman whose pack has just demonstrated, in the most unambiguous possible terms, that she is worth less to them than her uncle's comfort. I was terrified, and I was furious, and underneath the terror and the fury was something else. Something I would not have been able to name in that moment, but that I have spent 6 years understanding with the increasing precision of someone who has had nothing but time and wilderness and the company of her own wolf to work it out. Underneath the terror and the fury was a certainty. Not about the future. I had no certainty about the future. I had no idea whether I was going to survive the night, let alone 6 years. The certainty was about something simpler and more fundamental. They were wrong. Not about the evidence. The evidence was real. I had been right about everything I had brought to that council. They were wrong about me, about what I was worth, about what leaving me in a winter forest was going to produce. They thought they were eliminating a problem. They thought that a 23-year-old she-wolf alone in the eastern forest in December was a variable that would simply stop being a variable when the cold arrived. They were wrong. They left me on a Thursday. I came back on a Tuesday morning, 6 years later, at the head of a community I had built from nothing, with 6 years of evidence and the Alpha King of the North standing beside me. And I stood on the Ashvale ground, where I had trained since I was 8 years old, and I watched every wolf in my uncle's pack lower their heads. Not because I demanded it, because I had earned it so completely that demanding it was not necessary. This is that story. Hello, my beautiful souls, and welcome back to Seleni's Shifter Romance Collection. I am so deeply glad you are here. The story you are about to experience is an original werewolf romance audiobook. Her own pack left her to die in the forest. She came back as Alpha Queen and made every one of them bow. Written by Selene Faxi and created exclusively for you and your entertainment. This is the story of a woman who was left with nothing and built everything. If that lands in you, if you know something about being left and surviving it, drop a comment and tell me. I want to hear from you. And where in the world are you listening from today? Tell me your city, your country. You are part of this family, and I want to know you are here. Now get settled, my loves. Isolde's story begins now. The exile declaration was read at 9 in the evening. Pack Council Chamber. A room she had been in 100 times over 23 years. For decisions both ordinary and significant, in the seat to the left of her uncle that she had occupied since she was old enough to attend council proceedings as the Alpha's designated heir. She had grown up in that room, had learned the mechanics of pack governance in that room, had argued her first position at 17, and had her first experience of winning a difficult vote at 19, and had, for 16 years, understood that room as one of the fixed coordinates of her life. She stood in the center of it as the declaration was read. Not in her seat, in the center. That was the exile protocol. The accused standing in the center while the council occupied the perimeter, which was an architectural arrangement designed to communicate something about the relationship between the community and the individual that did not require words to convey. She had brought the evidence 3 days before. 3 days was how long it had taken the council to deliberate and reach its conclusion, which was not deliberation in any meaningful sense. Deliberation requires the genuine consideration of available information, and what the Ashvale Council had done in those 3 days was not that. What they had done was assess the political landscape with the speed of people who understood exactly which way the threat ran, who determined that the evidence threatened the Alpha's position, and that the Alpha's position was the thing that maintained everyone else's position, and who arrived at the conclusion that had been available from the first moment. Remove the variable. The declaration was read by the council's senior elder, an old wolf named Parch, 70 years old, who had known Isolde since she was 7, and who read the formal exile language in the specific voice of someone performing a task they have decided to treat as purely procedural, because the alternative to treating it as purely procedural was to acknowledge what it actually was. Stripped of rank, stripped of packmark, stripped of Ashvale membership, exiled to the eastern boundary with immediate effect. Her uncle sat in his chair at the head of the council table and did not look at her. He was looking at the table. The specific posture of a man who has made a decision and has decided that looking at its consequences is not required. His hands were flat on the table surface. She noticed his hands because she had always noticed hands. It was a fighter's habit, and she had been a fighter since she was 8 years old. And they were still, not tense, still with the deliberate stillness of a man who has practiced managing his own tells. She looked at him for the full duration of the declaration being read. He did not look up. "Do you have anything to say?" Parch asked when the reading was done. It was protocol. The exile had to be offered the opportunity to respond. It was also, in this instance, an offer with no real opening behind it, because the decision had been made and the response would not change the decision. She looked at her uncle's downturned head. "Not to this council," she said. "Not tonight." Parch nodded. The 6 wolves who had been standing at the chamber door, assigned, she understood, to the specific purpose of walking her to the boundary, moved toward her. She did not resist. She walked between them through the pack's central ground, through the familiar geography of the place she had grown up in. The training yard where she had learned to fight, the communal hall where she had eaten 1,000 meals, the elder trees at the territory's center that the pack had been meeting under for 4 generations. And she held her wolf still, and she walked. The 6 wolves walked with her in silence. None of them were friends. Not enemies either. They were wolves doing what they had been assigned, managing their own discomfort with the task in the specific way of people who have decided that compliance is not the same as complicity. She did not absolve them of the distinction, but she understood it. The eastern boundary in December was marked by a stone cairn, a traditional pack boundary marker maintained by each generation, the stones restacked by hand every 10 years as a pack ceremony. She had restacked those stones herself at 18 with her pack around her, in the ceremony that was her first formal act as the Alpha's heir. She stopped at the cairn. The 6 wolves stopped. One of them, a male wolf named Korath, who had trained beside her for 8 years, who she had fought beside and bled beside, and whose name she had known since they were children, looked at her for one moment. Just one. The specific brief eye contact of a man who is not going to do the right thing, but needs her to know that he knows it is wrong. She held his gaze. He looked away. They turned and walked back toward the pack lights. She stood at the boundary cairn and watched them go. Her wolf was howling. Not aloud. Inside, in the place where wolves felt the things that could not be said. The deep biological devastation of severance from pack and territory, and the accumulated sense of belonging that 16 years had built, and 6 wolves walking away, had dissolved in the time it took them to reach the tree line and vanish. She held the wolf's howling inside her chest, and she breathed, and she counted. Not from calm, from the specific necessity of a woman who needed her mind operational, and understood that operational required getting through the next 60 seconds. 1, 2, 3. The pack lights disappeared between the trees. She turned. She faced the eastern forest. The trees were old growth. Scots pine and ash, and the deep-rooted oak that the eastern woodlands were built on, the canopy closing above the first 20 meters of forest, and the darkness inside it complete. The cold was the specific cold of a forest at night in December. The cold that came off the ground and off the bark and off the air itself with equal measure. The kind of cold that did not distinguish between what it touched. She was wearing her training gear, fitted layers, combat boots, the gear she had been in when they came for her because they had not given her time to change. No weapons, no pack supplies, no anything except what she was wearing and what she carried inside her, which was considerable. She was 23 years old, and she had been trained as a warrior since she was 8, and she had grown up in these woodlands, and she knew how to survive in them. She also knew that knowing how to survive and surviving were related but not identical, and that December was not forgiving of the gap between them. She stepped across the boundary cairn, into the eastern forest. She did not look back. And the wolf inside her, howling, devastated, severed, did something in the moment she crossed the boundary and committed to what was on the other side of it, that Isolde would spend 6 years thinking about. The howling stopped. Not from peace. From the specific, cellular animal intelligence of a wolf that has received the message, "We are alone. We are in danger. This is what is," and has recalibrated from grief to survival in the particular way that things which intend to live have always done. "We are not done," her wolf said, not in words, in the cessation of the howling and the arrival of something else in its place. Something colder than the December air and considerably more durable. "We are not done." She walked into the forest. She found shelter before midnight, a fallen oak, ancient and broad, that had created a hollow large enough to keep the wind off. She collected pine boughs. She made a fire with the friction start method she had been taught at 10 and had not used since a survival training exercise at 16. The fire was small, and it was enough. She sat in the hollow of the fallen oak with the small fire between her and the December cold, and she let herself feel, completely, without management, everything that the walk from the council chamber to this fallen oak had been. She gave herself 1 hour. At the end of the hour, she fed the fire, and she thought about the morning. What the morning required? What the morning after that required? The immediate and the incremental, the first problem and the next one, the specific forward thinking of a person who has decided to survive and is building the architecture of how. 1 hour of feeling. Then she began. Present day. The stronghold occupied a natural clearing in the eastern forest's deep interior, a place Isolde had found in the 2nd year of her exile, when she had been ranging the woodland in the methodical way of someone who understood that knowledge of terrain was a resource as valuable as any weapon. The clearing was defensible, ringed by old growth on 3 sides, with the 4th side opening to a highland rise that provided both visibility and a natural deterrent to approach. She had built the first structure with her own hands, a 2-room building of timber and stone, fitted against the rising ground, designed for durability over comfort and achieving both. That first building was now the stronghold's training center. The community had grown, not quickly, not in the way of a place that advertised itself, but in the steady, organic way of something that existed and that exiled wolves found when they were running out of options. Word traveled in the way that important things traveled in the wolf world. Not in announcements, but in the specific, underground current of information between wolves who needed something and other wolves who knew where it was. An exile from a southern pack. Then 2 rogues who had been living rough in the western highlands. Then a she-wolf who arrived in the 3rd year with 3 pups she was raising alone. Then more. 17 now. A community, a training ground, a food production system that Isolde had designed in the 4th year, when the population reached the point that foraging was no longer sufficient. An infirmary, 3 permanent structures and 4 more under construction. A defensive perimeter that any of the pack world's ranking warriors would have looked at with respect. And an alpha. Isolde had not taken the title. She had not declared it, had not performed any ceremony, had not asked for it. What had happened was considerably less dramatic and considerably more real. The community had needed leadership. Leadership had emerged from the most capable person present, and the community had recognized the emergence with the biological directness of wolves who do not need a ceremony to know what they are responding to. Dace had called her Alpha first. 4 years ago, in the middle of a training session, addressing a question about defensive strategy to Alpha Isolde as naturally as if he had been doing it for years. She had looked at him. He had looked back with the expression of a man who has said an obvious thing and is waiting for the obvious thing to be accepted. She had accepted it. Now, in the stronghold's training ground on a cold November morning, she was running the community's daily training with the focused authority of a woman who'd been doing this for 4 years and had built it from her own knowledge. The warrior training she had received at Ashvale, refined through 6 years of necessity into something leaner and more practical than anything the Pack's formal program had produced. 12 wolves on the ground, 6 in pairs working the combat patterns she had designed, 2 on perimeter observation, the others on maintenance rotation. The training ground was not large, but it was precise. The markings on it deliberate, the equipment built to her specifications, the whole thing bearing the specific character of something made with full attention by someone who understood exactly what was needed. She was watching Fen. He was 17, the newest arrival, 4 months ago, found at the stronghold's perimeter with Ashvale's exile mark fresh on his wrist, and the specific quality of a very young person who has been shown, far too early, that the people who were supposed to protect them will not. She had taken him in the way she took everyone in, without ceremony, with a bed and food, and the specific, non-negotiable expectation of contributing to the community according to his capacity. He was a good fighter. Better than his training had been. Ashvale's warrior program had always been good, and the foundations were there. What he lacked was confidence, which was not a surprise given what had been done to him, and which Isolde was addressing with the same methodical attention she brought to every structural problem. "Again," she said. "Left side." Fen adjusted his stance. Did it again. Better. She watched him for a moment, then moved her attention to the pairs working the combat patterns, then to the perimeter, then to the tree line to the north, where, for 23 days now, a wolf had been watching. She had known on the first day. The eastern forest was hers in the specific, complete way of someone who had inhabited and defended a territory alone for 6 years. She knew its sounds and its scents and the quality of its silences, and a watching wolf in the northern tree line was a variable she had registered within an hour of the watching beginning. She had spent 23 days assessing the situation. The watcher was not Ashvale. The scent was wrong, northern rather than eastern, with the specific marker of a highland territory. Not hostile. 23 days of watching without approach, without any attempt at entry, suggested intelligence and restraint rather than threat. Not a rogue. The quality of the watching was too disciplined, too patient, too consistent for a rogue. She had told Sable on the 3rd day. Sable had spotted him twice, once at the northern edge, once half a mile east, always in the tree line, always watching. Sable's assessment: strong, controlled, not sure what he's waiting for. Isolde's assessment: he's waiting for me to address him. Today, she was going to address him. She brought the training session to its close, the specific, compressed ending of a session that had run its full time and produced what she needed from it. The community dispersed to their rotation tasks. Dace fell into step beside her, and she gave him the morning's notes in the shorthand they had developed over 4 years. 3 adjustments to the combat pattern, a supply order for the construction team, a medical check needed for one of the younger wolves whose shoulder had been bothering her. "The northern tree line," she said at the end of the notes. "He's there again this morning," Dace said, not a question. "I know." She handed him the training notes. "Run the afternoon session. I'll be back by midday." Dace looked at her with the expression he wore when he had an opinion he was deciding whether to voice. "He's big," Dace said. "Sable said—" "I know what Sable said," Isolde told him. "Midday." She walked north. The forest received her the way it had for 6 years, with the specific and deep familiarity of terrain that has been walked so many thousands of times, it stops being navigated and becomes simply moved through, the body knowing the path before the mind decides it. She moved through the old growth with the quiet efficiency of a woman who belonged to this forest in every way that belonging could be understood. The northern tree line, 200 meters from the training ground. She walked into it. She found him 40 meters in, standing against an old Scots pine with his arms crossed, and the specific quality of someone who has been expecting this and is entirely prepared for it. He was large. Sable had not understated. Dark-haired, with the bearing of someone who had been in command of significant things for a long time. Not the performative authority of a man who needed people to register him, but the settled authority of someone whose position was so established it had stopped requiring maintenance. Dark eyes. A jaw set with the effort of a man managing several things at once. The specific management of someone who has been watching something for 3 weeks and has been trying, with incomplete success, to maintain the clinical distance of an investigation. He looked at her. She looked at him. Her wolf, the alpha wolf, the wolf that had been building in the eastern forest for 6 years and was not a small or tentative thing, registered him with a reaction she had not felt before. Not threat. Not the assessment response of an alpha encountering another alpha's territory. Something she did not have a category for yet. Something warm and specific and deeply, inconveniently present. She filed it. "You have been watching my territory for 23 days, she said. Her voice was even and direct, and carried the specific quality of a woman who has had 6 years to stop performing ease and simply be it. Explain yourself. He looked at her for one long moment with those dark eyes. Brennan Holt, he said. Alpha King of Caldervast. She held the name. Caldervast. Northern Highlands, significant territory, the Continental Council's northern representative, an Alpha King. She had not expected that specifically, though the quality of the watching had suggested someone with resources and the patience of someone accustomed to taking the time a situation required. I know who you are, she said. I asked why you're here. The corner of his mouth moved, something that was not a smile and was interested in becoming one. Because, he said, I have been investigating the Ashvale Pack's territorial operations for 2 years, and 3 weeks ago, I tracked a piece of evidence to this forest. What piece of evidence? He held her gaze. You, he said. I have to stop right here, my loves. I need to ask you something. Has someone ever left you, walked away, turned their back, abandoned you when you needed them, and you survived it? Not just survived. Became something because of it that you could never have become if they had stayed? Tell me in the comments. Because Isolde built a kingdom in the forest where they left her to die. And I believe some of you know exactly what that kind of survival looks like. You. One word that carried the weight of 2 years of investigation and 3 weeks of watching, and whatever else was in those dark eyes that she was not yet addressing. She stood in the northern tree line with the old pines around her and the eastern forest at her back, and looked at the Alpha King of Caldervast with the specific, focused attention of a woman who was extremely good at receiving information and separating what was relevant from what was not. What was relevant? He had been investigating Ashvale. He had tracked his investigation to her. He had been watching her territory for 23 days without approaching, which suggested he had something to offer rather than something to take, because a man who had something to take would not have waited 23 days. What was not yet relevant? The wolf reaction. The warm, specific, inconvenient warmth that her wolf had produced the moment she stepped into this section of tree line. She filed it in the not yet relevant section and kept it there with the deliberate discipline of a woman who had been managing difficult things in order of priority for 6 years. "Investigating how?" she said. He unfolded his arms. Not an aggressive movement. The specific, deliberate movement of a man choosing to take a less defensive posture, because the situation had moved past the point where defensive posture was the honest one. "The Ashvale Alpha has been selling eastern woodland parcels to a territorial group called Vren," he said. "Vren is not a pack. It is a land acquisition operation that has been purchasing wolf territories through corrupt alpha agreements for 11 years. 7 territories compromised so far. Ashvale is the 8th. She held this. You have evidence of the Vren operation. 2 years of it. Documentation of 8 transactions, correspondence between Grieve Vorn and Vren's 3 principals, financial records." He looked at her. "What I have not been able to reconstruct is the originating evidence. The first documentation of the Ashvale transaction. The piece that connects Grieve to Vren at the beginning of the operation rather than in its middle." She was completely still. "Because the person who had that evidence," she said carefully, "was exiled 6 years ago." "Yes," he said, "and you spent 2 years finding that person. The exile record is not public. Pack councils don't publish the reasons for exile decisions, they record them internally. I had to reconstruct the council vote through a Continental Records request, which took 14 months to process. When I finally got the record, and it cited the exile grounds as undermining pack authority." His expression did something, not contempt exactly. The specific quality of someone who has encountered an injustice in documentation form and has had time to let the anger settle into something more useful. "Which told me the real reason was something else. And then you found the tracking signature. The Ashvale Territory's Alpha Scent Register changed 6 years ago. The register records pack alpha markers. I was cross-referencing territorial records when I found it. A secondary alpha marker appearing in the eastern forest region 18 months after the exile. Getting stronger every year." He held her gaze. "Yours." She looked at him. The eastern forest around them was conducting its own quiet morning. The wind in the upper canopy, the specific cold of deep woodland in November, a bird calling 3 times and stopping. She had stood in this forest through 48 seasons of exactly this kind of morning, and the familiarity of it was the ground she thought best on. "You knew I was an alpha before you came," she said. "I knew there was an alpha strength signature in the eastern forest that was not registered to any pack. I suspected what it was. And when you arrived 3 weeks ago and found me, I found a community of 17 wolves, a fortified stronghold, a functional training program, and an alpha operating without continental recognition in a territory she had been building for 6 years. A pause. The dark eyes were direct. I was not going to walk in on the first day. She looked at him for a moment. You were assessing. So were you, he said. She held that. He was right. She had known he was there from the first day, and she had made her own assessment over 23 days, not just of the threat level, but of the quality of the person, the patience of the watching, the specific discipline of someone who did not intrude before they had enough information to know what the intrusion would be entering. She had assessed him and arrived at the same conclusion she suspected he had arrived at. This is someone worth the conversation. The originating evidence, she said. I still have it. He went very still, not the calculating stillness of someone adjusting strategy. The specific stillness of someone who has spent 2 years looking for one thing and has just been told where it is. All of it? He said. Every document I brought to the council 6 years ago, preserved. She held his gaze. I have been keeping them because I always knew I was going to need them. He looked at her for a long moment with those dark eyes. You have been planning to go back, he said. I have been waiting until I was ready, she said. There is a difference. What changed? He said. 4 months ago, the new arrival. She looked at him. He had been watching for 23 days and he had been paying attention. Fenn's arrival. The 17-year-old with Ashvale's fresh exile mark. He had seen Fenn arrive, and he had drawn the conclusion that a man who had been investigating Ashvale's operations for 2 years would draw. Something had tipped a decision. A child, she said. He exiled a 17-year-old child for independent thinking? Brennan's jaw set. She read it precisely. Not anger for her, though there was that too, underneath the controlled surface of him. Anger for the 17-year-old, the specific, direct fury of a man who led his territory with a specific set of principles and found certain violations of those principles personally intolerable. I need to see the evidence, he said. You need to be invited to my stronghold first, she said. He held her gaze. A beat. Yes, he said. I do. She looked at him for one last moment, at the dark eyes and the set jaw, and the specific quality of someone who was powerful enough to have taken a different approach to this conversation entirely, and had chosen not to. Come at noon, she said. Yourself and 2 wolves, no more. Leave the others at the forest boundary. Understood, he said. She turned. Isolde Vorn, she said over her shoulder, because she had not given him her name, and the omission was its own kind of test. I know, he said. She walked back into her forest. He arrived at noon exactly. Himself and 2 wolves. She had watched them approach from the stronghold's eastern observation point, tracking their movement through the forest with the ease of someone who knew every sight line and every gap in the canopy. They moved well. The 2 wolves behind him were disciplined, pack warriors, she assessed, the genuine kind rather than the political kind, which was a distinction she had learned to make with precision. They followed him with the specific quality of people who trusted the person they were following, not because they were required to, but because they had evidence for it. She met them at the stronghold's outer boundary. The community knew they were coming. She had told Dace at midday, had told Sable to keep the training ground clear, had made the quiet, practical preparations of a woman who was receiving a significant visitor in her own territory on her own terms. The stronghold was not tidied or dressed up. It was exactly what it was. Functional, built, inhabited, the genuine evidence of 6 years of determined construction. And she was not going to diminish it by performing anything for his benefit. He looked at it when he came through the outer perimeter. Really looked. Not the quick scan of a man assessing a threat. The specific, engaged attention of someone receiving the full significance of what they were seeing. The buildings, the training ground, the food production setup, the community moving through its afternoon tasks, the wolves who lived here doing what they did, not pausing their lives for a visitor, because Isolde had specifically told them not to. Something moved in his expression. She caught it. Precise. The way she caught things. The way 6 years of watching had sharpened her reading of people past the point of error. It was not condescension. It was not the adjusted expectations of a man encountering something better than he anticipated, which would have been its own kind of insult. It was simpler and more honest than either of those. Recognition. The expression of someone who has been told something and has now seen it and found that the seeing confirmed what the telling suggested. He turned to her. "You built this," he said. Not a question. A statement made with the specific weight of someone who understood what building meant. "The community built it," she said. "I designed it." He nodded once. Precise. The nod of a man who knew the distinction and respected it. She took him to the records room. The small, specific space she had built in the stronghold's second year, lined with the waterproofed containers she had spent considerable resources acquiring, that held the only things she had carried out of Ashvale that had not been taken from her. Not because she had been clever enough to hide them on the night of the exile. She had not. They had been in her training quarters, and the exile wolves had taken nothing except her weapons and her rank insignia. The documents had been filed in the council archive. She had gone back for them. Not immediately. 3 months after the exile, in late February, when the worst of the winter was past, and she had survived, and the question of what came next had moved from survival to purpose. She had gone back to the Ashvale boundary at night, in her wolf form. Small enough to pass under the boundary sensors, fast enough to clear the pack's outer patrols, familiar enough with the council archive's location to find it in under 8 minutes. She had taken every document she had placed there 6 years before. She had carried them back to the eastern forest in her wolf's mouth. She had been 23 years old, and she had been in the forest for 3 months, and she had crossed a defended pack boundary alone at night to retrieve documents because she had understood. With the specific clarity of a woman who had just had her entire life stripped from her, that the documents were the thing. They were the reason for everything. They were the reason Grieve had exiled her. They were the thing that made her valuable rather than simply discarded. They were the foundation of the return that she did not yet know the shape of, but that she knew, with the same certainty she had known she was going to survive, was coming. She opened the first container. She placed the documents on the table. Brennan looked at them. She watched him read. The specific, focused attention of a man processing legal and financial documentation with the experienced precision of someone who had been doing exactly this for 2 years, moving through each page with the speed that comes from knowing what you are looking for. So pausing at the significant elements, the small sounds of someone assembling a picture from its parts. He read for 40 minutes. She made tea. Not for hospitality exactly. She made tea because she was a practical woman, and standing in a room for 40 minutes was improved by having something to do with her hands. She set a cup beside him without comment. He picked it up without looking away from the documents. She noted this. At the end of 40 minutes, he set the last document down. He looked at her. "This is everything," he said. "Yes." "The originating transaction, the first correspondence, the initial land parcel agreement." He looked at the documents on the table. "Combined with what I have, the 2 years of subsequent transactions, this is an unambiguous case." "I know," she said. It was always an unambiguous case. The council's decision was not about the evidence. "No," he said. "It was not." He looked at her for a moment. "You have been keeping this for 6 years," he said. "Yes. In a waterproofed container in a forest stronghold you built from nothing." "Yes." "Waiting until you were ready to use it." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The dark eyes were doing something she had not seen in them yet. Not the analytical assessment of a man processing strategy, not the controlled authority of an alpha king managing a situation. Something underneath both of those. Something that was the specific, unguarded quality of a person encountering something that requires the removal of their usual frameworks. "Why didn't you go to the Continental Council directly?" he asked. 6 years ago, after the exile. The evidence was sufficient. It was a good question. It was the question she had asked herself in the first year, in the second year, in the cold, clear moments of the eastern forest when the strategic thinking was loudest. Because I was 23, she said, and I was alone, and the Ashvale Alpha's political connections in the Continental Council run 3 generations deep. She held his gaze. Evidence is necessary. It is not always sufficient without the weight to deliver it. And now? She looked at him. Now I have a community of 17 wolves, 6 years of territorial claim on the eastern forest, an alpha standing in my records room who has 2 years of corroborating evidence, and a 17-year-old boy in my training ground who deserves to have someone go back and make it count. Brennan held her gaze for a long moment. The weight, he said, that you needed. Part of it, she said. I am the other part. He was quiet for a moment longer. Then, what do you need from me? She looked at him. She had thought about this question. She had been thinking about it for 23 days, in the specific way she thought about strategic problems. From multiple directions, stress testing each approach, arriving at the version that was most honest and most precise. I need the Continental Council's endorsement of my Eastern Forest claim, she said. Caldervast's backing would make the application uncontestable. She paused. I need a co-presenter for the evidence, someone the council cannot dismiss on political grounds. Another pause. And I need a witness when I go back to Ashvale. Not protection, he said. Not a correction, a confirmation. He had understood. Not protection, she confirmed. A witness. What I am going to do in Ashvale, I am going to do myself. I need someone standing beside me who represents the Continental Order's interest in the outcome. He nodded. All of that, he said, is within my authority to give. I know, she said. Then I'll give it, he said. On one condition. She looked at him. The condition is not a restriction, he said. The condition is that everything we do, the council application, the evidence presentation, the return to Ashvale, we plan together. Not me planning and informing you. Together. Equal input. Because you have 6 years of intelligence on Ashvale that I don't have, and I have 2 years of Continental Council intelligence that you don't have. And the combination of both of those is considerably more effective than either one alone. She held his gaze. She had been expecting a condition that would require her to give something. What he had offered was a condition that gave her more. She understood this, and she understood the man who had offered it with the specific completeness of a woman who was very good at reading people. Agreed, she said. The formal evidence exchange was scheduled for the 3rd day after their initial meeting. Brennan would bring 4 wolves from his delegation, his second, his records keeper, and 2 territorial witnesses who would formally attest to the continental authenticity of Caldervast's documentation. Isolde's side, herself, Dace, and the records container. Or the meeting would produce a combined evidence portfolio that could be presented to the Continental Council as a single, unified case. She had organized the stronghold's main hall for it, the largest internal space, a long timber table that she had built in the 3rd year for exactly this kind of occasion. The records containers on the side shelf. Natural light from the eastern windows. Functional. Precise. The space of a woman who had been conducting serious business for years and knew how it was done. The 4 Caldervast wolves arrived 20 minutes early. She had expected Brennan to arrive with them. He arrived 10 minutes after. She noted the delay without reading into it. because she had enough data on him now to know that a man this organized arriving 10 minutes after his own delegation was a choice rather than an accident, and that the choice was likely something to do with giving her advance contact with his wolves rather than arriving as a unit that required her to receive them all at once. The 4 wolves were professional. She assessed them in the first 2 minutes. Brennan's second was a she-wolf named Calla, late 30s, with the focused intelligence of someone who had been in significant decision-making roles for long enough to have stopped performing any part of the competence. The records keeper was younger, male, with the specific absorbed attention of someone who genuinely loved documents. The 2 witnesses were senior wolves, polished and reliable. She had sent Dace out for the first briefing. Sable was managing the training ground. The Caldervast wolves settled at the table. The records keeper began the preliminary organization of Brennan's documentation with the practiced efficiency of someone who did this often. Calla looked around the stronghold's main hall with the specific attention of a she-wolf alpha's second encountering another alpha's space and making her own assessment. Their eyes met briefly. Calla gave her a single nod, the nod of one professional woman recognizing another without excess commentary. Isolde returned it. Then one of the territorial witnesses, the older male, a wolf named Garrett, did the thing. She recognized the type. Garrett was a wolf who had spent 30 years in the Continental Council's official structures and had developed, in those 30 years, the specific habit of territorial hierarchies, placing people in their positions before receiving them as they were. He was not malicious. He was calibrated to a system that she had never been part of and that he had never questioned, and the calibration was so deep it did not read itself as assumption. He turned to her with a document and said, in the polished language of the Continental Council's formal register, "If you could have your senior official review this preliminary framework, the Alpha King's second can clarify any terminology that's unfamiliar to a..." He did not finish the sentence. Not because Isolde stopped him, because a sound came from the stronghold's doorway. Low, involuntary. The specific, unmistakable register of a wolf's mate growl. Not a warning snarl, not a dominance display, not any of the aggressive vocalizations of wolf hierarchy. The mate growl, the sound that a wolf makes when its mate is in perceived threat proximity and the wolf's body does not ask permission before responding. It came from Brennan. He was standing in the doorway. He had arrived in time to hear the last part of Garrett's sentence, and his wolf had responded before Brennan's considerable self-control had time to consult on the matter. The sound lasted perhaps 2 seconds. The silence that followed lasted considerably longer. Every wolf in the hall had heard it. Every wolf in the hall knew what it was. Garrett had gone completely still with the expression of a man who has just understood several things simultaneously, including that his sentence had been the worst possible thing to say, and that the consequences of it were both immediate and ongoing. So Calla had looked from Brennan to Isolde and back with an expression that Isolde would, later, describe to Sable as comprehensively unsurprised. The records keeper was looking at his documents with the focused attention of a man choosing wisely to be professionally occupied. Dace, to Isolde's left, made a sound that was not quite a cough. She looked at Brennan. He was looking at her with the expression of a man whose wolf had just done something he had been managing against for 3 weeks and who was now in the position of deciding, in front of 8 witnesses, how to handle the aftermath of the management failing completely. His expression had, underneath the control, the specific quality of someone who is mortified and is not going to let mortification be the primary response, because there are more important things to address. He looked at Garrett. "Isolde Vorn is the alpha of this territory," he said. His voice was entirely even. "She has been conducting significant military and community operations here for 6 years. There is no terminology in Continental Council documentation that will be unfamiliar to her. Please proceed accordingly. Garrett opened his mouth, then closed it, then nodded. Of course, he said. My apologies. Isolde held the situation for one moment. Then she looked at Brennan with an expression that contained several things in careful layers. Acknowledgement of what had just happened, assessment of what it meant, and the specific, privately entertained quality of a woman who had not expected to find this particular situation interesting and was finding it extremely interesting. Thank you, she said. To Garrett, for the record. Then, to Brennan, in a voice low enough for only him to hear. Outside, when we're done. He met her eyes. Yes, he said. The formal exchange took 2 hours. Efficient. The combination of her originating documents and his 2 years of subsequent evidence was exactly what both of them had understood it would be. Comprehensive, legally irrefutable, the kind of case that the Continental Council could not dismiss on political grounds, regardless of Greaves' network, because the documentation answered every question before it could be asked. Calla had done most of the technical assembly with the focused competence of someone who did this at speed and well. Isolde had watched the process with the specific attention of someone whose documents were being handled and who had strong opinions about that. Calla had handled them correctly. At some point, and in the middle of the second hour, the two of them had arrived at a working rhythm. Not warm, not social, but the specific mutual respect of two women who were both good at the same thing and had recognized it. Garrett had been precise and professional for the remainder of the meeting. When the exchange was complete, Isolde excused Dace and the Caldervast wolves to the stronghold's common area. Calla had looked at Brennan briefly, the specific glance of a second checking whether her alpha required the room, and he had given her the smallest nod that said clearly, "Yes, I need the room." They were alone. The long table between them, the combined evidence on its surface, the eastern light coming through the windows in the late afternoon gold of November. The stronghold around them, with its sounds, the community moving through its late afternoon tasks, the training ground's distant rhythm, the ordinary life of a place that had been built with intent and was fulfilling its purpose. She sat down across from him. He sat. "The mate growl," she said, directly, with the precision she brought to every significant thing. He held her gaze. "Yes." "Your wolf." "My wolf," he confirmed, without significant prior notice to me, for which I would like to register a formal complaint with the relevant biological authority. She looked at him for a moment. Then she did something she had not done in 6 years in the context of another person doing something she found genuinely funny. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He saw it. Something in his expression shifted. Not the controlled management of an alpha king, not the professional authority, but the specific, unguarded quality of a man who has just seen something he has been trying not to want to see, and has found that not wanting to see it is no longer an operational position. "I have felt it," she said, "since the tree line." "I know," he said. "I have been managing it for 3 weeks. How has the managing been going?" "Today," he said, "not particularly well." She held this for a moment, the honesty of it, the specific, direct, no-performance honesty of a man who could have managed the conversation differently and was choosing not to. "I am not going to tell you it isn't real," she said. "It is. My wolf has been clear about it since the moment I stepped into your section of the tree line." "Mine as well." "And I am not going to tell you what it means for the future, because the future is not what I am focused on." She held his gaze. "What I am focused on is Ashvale, the return, the evidence, what needs to happen." "I know," he said, "and I need you to understand something," she said. Specifically, before anything between us develops past the mate pull into something with actual architecture. He was listening with the complete attention of a man who understood that what was being said was important and required more than surface reception. "I have been alone in this forest for 6 years," she said. "I built this community. I built this stronghold. I became an alpha in the eastern woodland with no pack endorsement and no continental recognition and no one standing beside me for the first 2 years of it except my own wolf and whatever the forest was willing to give." She kept her gaze direct. "I am not looking for completion from another person. I am not looking to be protected or managed or carried. I have carried myself through things that would have ended most wolves, and I know exactly what I am capable of." "Yes," he said. "I know." "Then I need you to understand that what I am willing to build with you, if I am willing to build with you, is built on equal ground, not you leading and me following, not your authority and my gratitude. Equal, which means that the return to Ashvale is mine. My plan, my timing, my reckoning. You contribute what you offered, your testimony, Caldervast's backing, your presence as the Continental Order's witness." "Beside you," he said. "Not in front." "Beside me?" she confirmed. "Not one step ahead. Not one decision made on my behalf without my input. If that is something you can do, genuinely, not performatively, then we have something to talk about." He looked at her for a long moment. The dark eyes were entirely present, not calculating, not managing, not the Alpha King running the strategic assessment of a situation, simply present, with the specific quality of a man receiving something completely rather than filtering it through his usual frameworks. "I have been building a territory for 8 years, he said. 8 years of making decisions for an entire community of wolves who depended on those decisions being right. And the specific thing I have learned in 8 years of that, the thing that has surprised me most about leadership, is that the decision I make alone is almost never as good as the decision I make with someone who knows something I don't." He held her gaze. "You know everything about Ashvale that I have been trying to reconstruct for 2 years. You know the Eastern Forest. You know Grieve. You know the pack's internal dynamics. You know what needs to happen and in what order." A pause. "I would be an idiot to stand in front of that." She looked at him. "Beside," she said. "Beside," he said. "Yes." She held the word in the space between them for a moment. Beside, the specific word she had named, offered back to her not as compliance, but as genuine understanding of why it was the right word. "Then we have something to talk about," she said. Outside the stronghold, the eastern forest was conducting its evening. The light going amber in the canopy, the community moving toward the shared meal that ended every day in this place. The ordinary and extraordinary life of something that had been built from nothing by a woman who had been left to die and had decided otherwise. They talked until dark. 12 days. 12 days of planning and preparation and the specific, focused work of 2 people who were both excellent at strategy and who had discovered, with the slightly surprised quality of people who are accustomed to being the smartest person in the room and have encountered someone equally capable, that working together was faster and better than working separately. She had told him things she had not told anyone. Not in the planning sessions. In the hours around the planning sessions. In the specific spaces that formed naturally when 2 people were working together, and the work required breaks, and the breaks required conversation, and the conversation moved. Wallace as conversation does when people are genuinely interested in each other, past the professional into the real. She had told him about the second winter. The 2nd December, a year after the exile, when the cold had been worse than the first, and the stronghold had not yet been fully built, and she had been sick for 3 weeks with the specific sickness of a wolf who has been living at the edge of her capacity for too long. She had not told Dace. She had not told anyone. She had managed it alone in the way she managed everything alone in those years. Completely and without performance, and with the particular cost of things that are carried without help. He had listened to this with the specific quality of attention he brought to everything she said. Not pity, not the managed sympathy of someone performing care. Simply present, receiving it. And she had found, to her own slight surprise, that the telling of it was lighter than the carrying. She had told him about Fenn's arrival, the specific moment she had seen the Ashvale exile mark on his wrist, the same mark she had been given 6 years before on a 17-year-old boy who had the look of someone who had just discovered that the world was considerably more dangerous than he had believed. She had sat with him for an hour, not with comfort, not with platitudes, with practical information. This is how the first winter works. This is what you will need. This is what I will tell you, and this is what you will figure out yourself. She had told Brennan this, and she had watched something move through his expression that was not sympathy and was not anger and was the specific and complex quality of someone understanding something about another person that reorganized the understanding of everything before it. The community assembled for the march on a Tuesday morning. All 17 wolves, plus Brennan's 4-wolf delegation, making 21 total, moving through the eastern forest toward the Ashvale boundary with the specific quality of a force that understood what it was walking toward and had no uncertainty about the walking. Isolde led. Not from the center of the formation, from the front. Not because front walking was a performance of authority, but because the front was where she had always walked. Because the front required the most complete knowledge of the terrain and the situation, and she had both, and there was no practical reason to be anywhere else. Brennan walked beside her. She noted this with the specific precision she brought to noting things. Not behind her, beside her. At the pace she set. Without the slight forward lean that powerful men sometimes performed, unconsciously, when they were beside rather than ahead. Precisely beside. Honoring the word she had given him and he had given back. They reached the forest's edge as the afternoon light went long and gold. She stopped. The Ashvale boundary was visible through the last tier of the forest. The boundary cairn, restacked by hands that were not hers, marking the edge of a territory she had grown up in and been expelled from and was about to re-enter. She looked at it for a moment. "Tonight?" Brennan said beside her. "Tomorrow at dawn," she said. "We camp here tonight." He nodded. The community settled. The practical and efficient settlement of people who had been trained by her and knew how to occupy ground without ceremony. Dace organized the perimeter. Sable ran a final briefing with the younger wolves. The Caldervast delegation integrated with the professional ease of people who had done this before. At midnight, she was sitting at the forest's edge alone. She was looking at the Ashvale territory. At the lights that were visible at the pack's center. Distant, warm. The lights of a community she had loved for 23 years and been discarded by and built herself back from. She examined herself carefully, feeling hatred. She had felt hatred in the first year. It had been real, and it had been useful. Had kept her moving when moving was what survival required. And she had used it, and then she had let it go because hatred was expensive fuel, and there were better kinds available. What she felt, looking at those lights, was something she could call completion. The specific quality of a long thing arriving at its ending. Not revenge. She had been precise about this in her own mind for years. Not revenge, but accountability. The specific difference between the two, which she had worked out in the eastern forest over 6 years, was this. Revenge was about making someone feel what you had felt. Accountability was about correcting what had been done so it could not be done again. She heard his footsteps. She did not turn. "You were supposed to be sleeping." "I was," Brennan said. I woke up." He sat beside her, not close enough to intrude on the aloneness. Beside her, with the specific quality that she had learned in 12 days, was the characteristic way he occupied space near her. Present without consuming. "Tell me something," she said. "About the night they exiled you." She paused. "Something you have not told anyone else." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have not been exiled." "I know," she said. "I mean the equivalent. The night something was taken from you that you had not been prepared to lose." He held that for a moment. "My father died the year I became Alpha," he said. "Not from illness, from a pack internal challenge. A wolf who wanted the territory and who challenged through the pack's formal process, and who my father, who was 62 years old and should have had 10 more years at minimum, won against, and the winning of it." He stopped. Chose a different path through the sentence. "The winning of it cost him everything the challenge had to cost. He lived 6 more months." She was looking at the Ashvale lights. "I became Alpha at 28, he said. "Because my father won a challenge he should never have had to fight, and it killed him. And the wolf who brought the challenge, who lost and left the territory and is living in another pack right now, is alive." She heard the specific thing in his voice that she recognized, because she had heard its equivalent in her own voice in the first years, when the grief was still acute enough to surface as sound. "And you built Caldervast anyway," she said. "What else was I going to do?" She looked at him. In the dark, at the forest's edge, with the Ashvale lights ahead and the eastern forest behind, the Alpha King of Caldervast looked back at her with those dark eyes and the expression she now knew as his most honest one. The one underneath the control. The one that had been present in every significant moment of the 12 days she had known him. "What else was I going to do?" she said quietly, not a question. He held her gaze. "In the morning," he said, "I will stand beside you." "In the morning," she said, "I will hold you to that." The Ashvale lights burned in the distance. She sat with him in the dark at the forest's edge, and she breathed, and she let the last of the night be what it was. The last quiet before the thing that had been 6 years in the building arrived at its moment. Dawn came, as dawn comes to the eastern woodlands in November. Slowly, and then all at once, the specific quality of a winter morning that has been building in the dark and arrives with the particular authority of something that does not hurry because it does not need to. Isolde had been awake since 4. She had not slept much, not from anxiety, from the specific high alert quality of someone whose body understands that today is the day and is running at the frequency that significant days require. She had reviewed the plan in the quiet pre-dawn hours with the methodical attention of someone who had been a warrior since 8 and knew that the review was not the same as doubt. It was the final sharpening of something that was already sharp. The community assembled at 5:30. 21 wolves. In the pre-dawn dark of the forest's edge, the specific gathering of a force that was made of varied pieces, exiles from 6 different packs, rogues who had found their way to the stronghold through different paths, 2 Caldervast-trained warriors alongside wolves who had been trained in the Eastern Forest's practical curriculum. They moved with a unity that was not uniformity. Each of them different, all of them Isolde's. She stood at the front. Brennan on her left, Dace on her right. Behind them, Sable and Calla beside each other in the specific proximity of two women who had arrived, over 12 days, at a mutual respect that neither of them was performing. She looked at the boundary cairn. The Ashvale boundary, marked by the stones she had helped restack at 18. The edge of the territory that was her birthright. The territory that had been taken from her by a man who had made a calculation about what she was worth and had arrived at the wrong answer. She shifted, not for the community. She did not need to perform for the people behind her, who had been following her for years and needed no demonstration. The claiming shift was not performance, it was law. The ancient wolf world law that predated the Continental Council and the pack system, and every political arrangement that Greaves' network had spent years constructing. Her wolf on Ashvale ground. Full shift on the boundary cairn with 20 witnesses. The claiming was irrevocable from the first moment of the shift, and it rang through the territory with the specific biological broadcast of ancient law. The claim was made, the claim was witnessed. The claim could not be undone by any council vote or any alpha's declaration. The Eastern Forest received the shift with the specific quality of a territory recognizing its alpha. Every animal in the old growth went still for the precise duration of the shift. Every wolf in the 21 behind her felt it in their wolf's biology. Not submission, recognition. The recognition of a she-wolf claiming what was hers with the full weight of her wolf behind it. She shifted back. The light was full now. The November sun in the eastern sky, low and gold, lighting the Ashvale boundary with the specific quality of a morning that knew what it was. She crossed the cairn into Ashvale territory. The border patrol saw them within 3 minutes. 2 wolves on morning watch. Young, she assessed. And from the specific quality of their posture when they registered what they were seeing, newly assigned to the boundary. They went still. Then one of them turned and ran toward the pack center, and the other stood with the specific frozen quality of someone who has just seen something that requires a response they have not been trained for. She did not address them. She kept walking. The word ran ahead of her through the pack in the specific speed of a community receiving news that disrupts everything. She could feel it. The ripple of response moving through the territory like a stone dropped in water. The specific quality of 60-some wolves registering simultaneously that something they had filed as past was no longer past. She came back. The pack's central ground was a large open space in the Ashvale territory's heart. She had known this ground since she was a child, had run on it and trained on it, and stood on it for pack ceremonies from the age of 7. The assembly that formed as she and her 21 wolves arrived was not called by Grieve. It formed because the claiming shift had activated the biological law that required pack presence, and the Ashvale wolves responded to the law the way wolves respond to the things that are in their biology, which is without having to decide to. 61 wolves. She stood at the edge of the central ground and looked at them, at the faces she had known. Some for 20 years, some for shorter. At the warriors who had trained beside her, and the council members who had read the exile declaration, and the ordinary pack wolves who had been living under Grieve's governance for 6 years and carrying whatever the governance had cost them. At the far edge of the central ground, her uncle, Isolde Vorn, 61 years old now. 6 years older than the last time she had seen him. Not from across a room, but face to face, the way she had faced him before the council with the evidence in her hands. His hair had grayed further. His bearing was the same, the posture of a man who had spent decades in a position that confirmed his authority and had built the specific, settled confidence of someone who had not been seriously challenged in a long time. He was looking at her. She was looking back. So 6 years of eastern forest winter, and building and surviving, and 17 wolves and fens wrist, and 21 people behind her, and Brennan beside her, and the documents in the waterproofed container, and the 2 years of corroborating evidence, and the Continental Council's elder, who had arrived at the Ashevale boundary yesterday, and was standing at the edge of the assembly with the specific quality of official witness that the Continental Order deployed when it was paying attention. All of it, present in this moment. She walked into the central ground. She did not shout. She had thought about this. In the 12 days of planning, in the midnight hours at the forest edge, in the first year of exile when the fury was loudest and the shouting would have been easiest. She had thought about what the reckoning looked like, and she had arrived at the same conclusion every time. It looked like evidence. It looked like documentation. It looked like the specific, irrefutable language of pack law, delivered in the clear, precise voice of a woman who had spent 6 years preparing to deliver it. Not rage. Not the performance of what had been done to her. She would not give the assembly the spectacle of her wound. She would give them the facts. She gave them the facts. For 40 minutes, on the Ashevale Central Ground in the November morning, Isolde Vorn presented the case against her uncle with the comprehensive precision of someone who had been building it for 6 years and had refined it past the point of any gap. The originating documents, the first transaction, the first correspondence, the first land parcel agreement, all dated 3 years before she had discovered them and brought them to the council. The 2 years of Caldervast's corroborating evidence, the subsequent transactions, the financial records, the Vren operation's full scope now documented and dated and traced. Elder Sorcha's Continental Council attestation, the independent investigation that had been running alongside Brennan's, now converging with hers on the same conclusion. She laid it out piece by piece, not dramatically, not with the theater of a confrontation designed for maximum impact, simply, methodically, in the specific language of pack law that she had been trained in since childhood, and that she knew better than anyone else on this ground. The Ashevale Assembly listened. She watched them the way she had always watched rooms, with the focused, comprehensive attention of a fighter who understood that the room was the landscape, and the landscape always told you what was happening. She watched the shift in the council members' faces as the evidence arrived. Not the shock of people hearing new information, but the specific, uncomfortable recognition of people who had filed a thing as decided and are finding that the deciding was built on a floor that has just been removed. She watched the warriors who had the practical clarity of people trained to assess reality rather than manage politics. She watched the ordinary pack wolves, the families, the younger wolves, the people who had simply been living their lives in a territory governed by a man whose governance they had not examined closely, because examining it had not, until now, seemed necessary. She watched them recalibrate. Grieve did not stay silent. He could not. She had known this, had planned for it. A man of his specific architecture could not sit in the center of his own assembly, while his niece dismantled his position without the attempt at intervention. He tried 3 times. The first time, she let him finish his sentence, and then addressed it with the specific document that answered the specific point, and moved on. The second time, Elder Sorcha addressed it with the Continental Council's formal authority before Isolde had to. The third time, Grieve looked at the assembly, looked at the faces around the ground, and at the wolves he had been governing for 30 years, at the specific arrangement of his power base, and something shifted in his expression. He recognized what was happening, not in the evidence. He had known the evidence was real since the night she had brought it to the council 6 years ago. He recognized what was happening in the faces. They were leaving him. Not physically. They were standing in the same positions they had occupied for 30 years. But the specific quality of presence was changing. The wolves who had been facing him were turning, incrementally, by degrees, in the way that communities turn when the foundation of their allegiance has been shown to be built on something that does not hold. It began with the youngest wolves. A girl of about 20. Isolde did not know her. She had been 14 when Isolde was exiled, who stepped slightly to the left, away from the group surrounding Grieve, toward the open ground between the two sides. Not dramatically, quietly. The specific small movement of someone whose decision had been made and whose body was expressing it before the formal declaration. Then 3 more. Then Korath, the wolf who had been at the boundary 6 years ago, who had given her that single moment of eye contact and looked away, who had been living with the cost of that looking away for 6 years. Korath crossed the central ground completely, not halfway, all the way. He stood on Isolde's side of the ground, and he faced his former alpha, and the specific quality of his standing was the standing of a man who had finally done the thing he should have done 6 years ago, and was receiving the relief of it, one by one, not quickly. The unhurried, organic movement of a community withdrawing consent in the way that communities withdraw it when they are doing it genuinely rather than performing it. Some of them quickly, some with the slow, effortful movement of wolves who had significant ties to the old structure and were cutting them in real time. Grieve watched it happen. She watched him watching it. The expression on his face. She had thought about this expression for 6 years, had wondered what it would look like on the man who had exiled her to a winter forest without looking at her. Why, it was not dramatic. It was not the collapse of a villain in a story. It was the specific, quiet expression of a man who has structured his entire life around a particular understanding of his own power and is watching that understanding dissolve. When the last wolf had moved, when the ground's arrangement made it visually, undeniably clear, Elder Sorsha stepped forward. The Continental Council's formal declaration of Grieve's removal from the alpha position took 4 minutes to read. He did not resist. She had wondered if he would resist. Had planned for it. Had 3 contingencies prepared. He did not resist. Not because he was a graceful man or a wise one, but because he was a calculating one, and the calculation had run its numbers, and the numbers were what the numbers were. He looked at Isolde once more before he was escorted from the central ground by 2 Continental Council wolves and 2 of Isolde's people. Dace on one side, one of Brennan's wolves on the other. She held his gaze. She did not give him anything in the holding. Not contempt, not forgiveness. That was a longer and more private road, one that she would travel in her own time and not on this ground. She simply held his gaze with the steady, direct eyes of a woman who had survived everything he had put in her way and had arrived, fully, at this moment. He looked away first. The bowing did not come from her request. She had not planned a ceremony, had not prepared a speech about the pack's future or a formal address to the assembly in her new authority. What she had planned was the evidence and the accounting and the removal of the man who had sold the pack's territory and exiled its rightful heir. And she had delivered all of that, and the rest she had decided, would arrive as it arrived. What arrived was this. The girl of 20, the first one who had moved, turned to face Isolde when Grieve was gone from the ground. She looked at her for a moment with the eyes of someone who was young and had grown up in a pack under governance that had not been what governance should be, and was standing in front of something it had not previously had access to. She lowered her head. The pack bow. Not demanded, given. The lowered head, the deliberate, full acknowledgement of an alpha who had earned it in every way that earning could be measured. It moved through the assembly, the way fire moves through dry woodland, not consuming, clarifying. The young wolves first, then the warriors, then the elders, then the ordinary pack wolves who had been living their lives under Grieve's governance and who were performing, in this gesture, both the release of the old and the receipt of the new. 60 wolves. Everyone. She stood in the center of the Ashvale ground, where she had trained since she was 8 years old, and she received it. Not with triumph, not with the performance of victory, with the specific, grounded completeness that she had felt once before, in the eastern forest, in the second year, when she had stood in the stronghold's first permanent structure, and understood with her whole body that she had survived and built something. That same completeness, but fuller. The arrival not just at survival, but at the thing that survival had been building toward. Brennan was beside her. He had been beside her for the entire reckoning, not performing his authority, not deploying the weight of Caldervast in front of her, simply present as she had asked him to be, standing to her left with the full weight of his position placed, explicitly and visibly, behind hers. When the bowing began and moved through the assembly, she felt him go still beside her. Not the controlled stillness of his alpha authority, but something else. The stillness of someone who is watching something that moves them past the professional. When the bowing was complete, when 60 wolves had lowered their heads and risen and were looking at her in the specific way of a community that has just committed its allegiance, she turned to Brennan. He was looking at her with those dark eyes and the expression she knew as his most honest one, fully present, nothing managed. Something in it that she had no word for yet and did not need a word for yet. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she said. "No," he said. "You did it. I stood beside it. That is not the same thing." She looked at him. "No," she said. "It is not." She looked at the assembly, at 60 wolves who were hers, who had chosen to be hers, who had made the decision themselves in the way that genuine authority was always eventually decided, by the people living under it, choosing to honor it. She looked at Fenn, who had positioned himself near the back of the assembly, and who was looking at her with the specific expression of a 17-year-old who has been shown, for the first time, what things can become. She held his gaze for a moment. The specific look between two people who have both worn the same mark, the exile mark, the mark that was meant to end things, and are standing on the other side of it. He lowered his head. She received it with the quiet, full completeness of an alpha queen who had earned every degree of the gesture. That evening, when the immediate logistics of Ashvale's transition had been addressed, when the community had eaten and the Caldervast delegation had settled, and the day had moved from the extraordinary into the ordinary in the way that extraordinary days always eventually do, Isolde walked to the eastern forest. Not far, just to the first tier of the old growth, where the boundary cairn sat in the November dark, and the forest opened beyond it, into the miles she had inhabited and built in and survived in for 6 years. Brennan came. She had not asked him to. She did not need to ask. They had arrived in 12 days of planning and 3 weeks of forest proximity, and the specific, irreversible intimacy of two people who had told each other things they had not told anyone else, at the place where words were less necessary than presence. He sat beside her on the boundary cairn. "Ashvale," she said. "I am going to rebuild it. The right way. The way a pack should be built." "I know," he said. "And the Eastern Forest community," she said. "They are mine. They stay under my authority." "Of course." "And the continental recognition, the Eastern Forest Territory claim, the Ashvale Alpha status." "Elder Sorsha is filing both documents tonight," he said. "They will be ratified within the month." She was quiet for a moment. "You have an answer for everything?" she said. "I have been paying attention for 23 days, he said. "Which does not feel like adequate preparation for you. But it is what I have." She looked at him, at the dark eyes in the November dark, at the set jaw and the quality of presence that she had been assessing with the precise attention she brought to everything that mattered for 3 weeks and 12 days. At the man who had been watching her territory because a 2-year investigation had led him to the Eastern Forest, and who had waited 23 days to address it because he understood that the addressing required the right moment, and who had said beside and had meant it for every subsequent day without exception. "The mate bond," she said. "I want to talk about what that looks like, between two alphas, practically." "I want to talk about it too," he said. "I have been thinking about it since the tree line." "Equal," she said. "Territories remain distinct. Caldervast is yours, Ashvale is mine. Neither subsumes the other. Decision-making for each territory stays with its alpha." "Agreed," he said. "Completely." "And what we build together," she said. "We build together. Equal input. The same agreement we made about the return." "The same agreement," he said. She looked at the boundary cairn beneath them, the stones of her own birth territory, the edge of the forest that had made her, the place where two worlds met that were now both hers. "I am not the woman they exiled," she said. "No," he said. "You are who she became, which is considerably more." She held that for a moment. "They thought they were ending me," she said. "They were freeing you," he said. "They just did not know it." She looked at him. Then she did something she had not done in 6 years in the full and present way that the action deserved. She leaned slightly, just slightly, the specific degree of a woman who has been entirely self-contained for 6 years and is choosing, deliberately and completely, to let one person inside the containment. Her shoulder against his. Not a collapse. Not a yielding. The specific, equal pressure of one strong thing resting against another strong thing and finding the resting good. He did not move toward it or away from it. He simply received it. The way the Eastern Forest had received her for 6 years. The way the right things always received the things that were meant for them. Completely, without adjustment, with the specific quiet certainty of a fit that was always going to be what it was. "Tomorrow," she said, "there is a great deal to do." "There is," he said. "Tonight," she said, "is enough." "Yes," he said. The November dark held the Eastern Forest and the Ashvale boundary, and the two wolves sitting on the stones of a territory that had been taken and reclaimed. And the boundary cairn was solid beneath them, and the night was entirely, perfectly quiet. "Oh, my beautiful souls, my beautiful, magnificent souls. We have reached the end of Isolde's story, and I am sitting here thinking about every woman who has ever been left somewhere, who has been told by someone who should have loved them that they were not worth the keeping. and who survived it and built something in the space where they were abandoned. You were not left behind. You were placed exactly where you were supposed to be. The forest that they put you in, you made it yours, and everything you built there, everything you carried and constructed and became in the wilderness of your surviving, was always going to be the foundation of your return. This has been her own pack left her to die in the forest. She came back as Alpha Queen and made every one of them bow. An original werewolf romance audiobook written by Celine Faxi, created with every piece of my heart exclusively for Celine's Shifter Romance collection. If this story reached something real in you, if Isolde's return moved you, please leave a comment and tell me. I read every single one, and tell me where in the world you are listening from today. Your city, your country, your corner of the earth. You are part of this family, and I need to know you are there. Until the next full moon, take the most fierce and extraordinary care of your beautiful, unbreakable selves.